On Thursday evening, October 14th, Professor Noam Chomsky addressed a crowd gathered at the Palestinian Cultural Center for Peace in the Allston neighborhood of Boston. This event was sponsored by the Gaza Mental Health Foundation and entitled Pressure Points: How Can We Promote Justice in Israel-Palestine? Professor Chomsky has just returned from Turkey, where lawyers have just recently petitioned the International Criminal Court to investigate Israel for war crimes committed when their military used deadly force on a Gaza-bound Turkish flotilla earlier this year. Nancy Murray of the Boston Coalition for Palestinian Rights introduced Noam Chomsky.
And meanwhile, I'm going to introduce our last speaker. And I was going to ask Dr. Elaine Hagopian to introduce him. Originally, I didn't know she could come. I had gone to talk to her, and she wasn't sure she could be here. The reason I was wanting her to introduce him is because she's known him longer, I think, than maybe anyone in this room. I asked her, how long had Professor Chomsky been active locally on this issue, as far as she knew? And she told me that she remembered him coming to her apartment after the 1967 war, and when she called a meeting to see, what can be done about the situation, and he was there. So that's a long time. By the way, where is Noam? There, okay. So that is a really long time. He has been in the forefront, according to Elaine, and I want to quote her now. It was Professor Chomsky, along with such champions of the Palestinian cause as Edward Said, Ibrahim Abu Lugod, and Eqbal Ahmed, who forced the question of Palestine into public consciousness in this country. And we in this room know how very much he has done over these last 40 years to keep it there. Now, I first met him 21 years ago when he agreed to speak for the Middle East Justice Network. He never turned down a subsequent invitation, even when it meant taking 3 different planes to get to a conference we once held in Wichita, Kansas. So, Noam, I want to take this opportunity to thank you not just for being here tonight, but for the innumerable times you have made yourself available to speak out for Palestinian rights. And Iyad al-Siraj also asked me to convey his gratitude for your participation tonight. Thank you.
I've just come back from Turkey a couple of days ago, and several events there turned out to be quite relevant to this conference, so let me mention them. One was, which will not surprise you, the mood of the general mood. The conference was on some other matter, but the mood of amazement that you found everywhere, that there was so little concern about the Mavi Marmara attack. I just couldn't believe how people in the United States, in the West generally, could ignore the fact that that an Israeli military forces had attacked a Turkish ship in international waters, hijacked it, brutally murdered 9 people, including an American citizen, and nobody seemed to bat an eyelash. That bears directly on the issue that we're supposed to focus on today. What can we do to advance the cause of justice in Palestine? And the first and most important thing that we can do, I'll keep coming back to this, is simply raise understanding and awareness and consciousness of what the facts are. Can't do that, nothing else is going to happen. That's a prerequisite for any meaningful action on this or any other issue. And you might say that in a sense it's the lack of concern over the Mavi Marmara attack is in a way justified. And if people here knew about the history and the events, they don't understand why. There's nothing new about it. Israel has been attacking ships in international waters for at least 30 years, killing people. This is mostly ships going from Cyprus to Lebanon, killing people, taking them as prisoners to Israel, often holding them for a long time as hostages, many of them in secret prisons. We don't know much about what's happened to them. It's been going on for 30 years. So what's the fuss about the Mavi Marmara? Well, it's a fair question, but of course it deepens the significance of overcoming our, so far, inability to bring the basic facts of these matters to the American public, which is the crucial one. If there's ever going to be a change for the better there, it's going to have to be initiated here. The other significant, for me, event in Turkey was that by coincidence, I was able to meet an old friend, Amira Haas, who most of you know, I suppose. She's, for those who don't, she's a marvelous person and journalist, lived in Gaza, one of the main specialists on Gaza. She's been living in Ramallah for many years, Israeli journalist. One of the dwindling group of people, unfortunately dwindling in Israel, who have not joined the drift to the jingoist right and have retained integrity, great integrity in her case. And she knows Gaza and the West Bank probably better than anyone. So I mentioned to her that I was going to be giving a talk in a couple of days and about Gaza, and she relating to Gaza. And I asked her what she thought I ought to emphasize. And she didn't hesitate. She said the thing that should be emphasized is the systematic policies of Israel since 1991, since the so-called peace process began, to separate Gaza from the West Bank, to break any connection between them. That's in direct violation of the explicit terms of the Oslo process, which declare that they're a territorial unity. And Israel understands that and wants to break that unity, and has been very carefully pursuing that policy right to the present. I should take a moment to make an aside here when I use a terminological point, but one that's extremely significant. When I mention Israel, what I mean to say is the U.S. and Israel. Everything that Israel does, it does with the authorization and decisive support of the United States. Otherwise, it can't do it. If the United States tells them you can't do it, they stop. That's been true over and over again. The support is direct participation, military, economic, diplomatic, and crucially ideological. By ideological, I mean shaping understanding and interpretation in such a way as to assure either popular support or at least apathy with regard to what the U.S. is doing. So I'll say Israel, but I mean always Israel and the United States, that is us. And that again bears in an obvious way on the question of what we should be undertaking if we want to overcome these atrocities and crimes. So the U.S. and Israel then have been very carefully separating Gaza from the West Bank in ways that go on regularly, and everything that's done is very carefully thought out, very carefully planned, just as in the West Bank. So, for example, those of you who may have been in the West Bank recently will have seen that the repression is less obvious and less severe than in the past. So many checkpoints are being dismantled, and a certain amount of economic development is being allowed. And the reason for that is that within the West Bank itself, the settler population, which is just an extension of Israel, means anybody from Israel or in the settlements, they live in a separate country. There's a big infrastructure of roads and highways, which make it possible to go from any point in Israel to any point in the Jewish-occupied area of the West Bank without even knowing that there are any Arabs there. And you might see somebody, on a hill leading a goat or something like that, and probably the Israeli tourist department will encourage that. It gives a kind of a nice biblical flavor to it when American tourists come. But you can do it without any sense that there's a population living there. And for the Arab population, they can also go from place to place without running into any Jewish population. Of course, there's a striking asymmetry when they go from place to place. They're going on tiny roads, circuitous paths. It may take you, 30 miles to get 10 miles away, if you're lucky and there isn't a heavy rain and the road is not impassable. But it's possible. So the separation is, there's a double separation. First, separation of Gaza from the West Bank, then separation of the Jewish areas of the West Bank from which are by now virtually indistinguishable from Israel itself, separating from whatever Arab population will be somehow able to survive there. The Jewish-occupied area by now is over 42% of the West Bank, and it's also extremely carefully planned. So if you look at the separation wall, it should be called an annexation wall, which incidentally is completely illegal. There isn't even any debate, there shouldn't be any debate about that. Ratified by the World Court unanimously, the U.S. Justice agreeing, and so on. I'll call it that. The annexation wall is designed to include within what Israel will take the core resources of the West Bank, which are the water resources. There's an aquifer on which Israel and the West Bank rely, which runs right along the border on the Palestinian side of the border, and Israel's taking it over. That also the most arable land and so on. And it kind of snakes around to ensure that the settlements will be within it. In addition, Israel's taking over the Jordan Valley. President Obama recently, who's been authorizing it all along, did it openly a couple of days ago by one of the concessions he offered to Israel that to induce them to continue to carry forward the settlement freeze was, their military equipment, so on and so forth, but also permanent stations in the Jordan Valley. It's a little redundant because they're already settling the Jordan Valley, and Palestinians have been barred from there by various means, and it's a substantial part of the country, and it imprisons the rest. So with the separation of Gaza, the West Bank is landlocked, doesn't have access to the outside world. That's quite crucial. And with the Israeli takeover of the Jordan Valley, what's left is imprisoned, and it's also broken up by salients that run through it, east of what's called Jerusalem. It's now Greater Jerusalem, far bigger than Jerusalem ever was. Illegally annexed, goes virtually to Jericho, bisects the West Bank, and two others farther north, one going to the town of Ariel, and then beyond, and one to the town of Kedumim and on. So that essentially breaks up the West Bank into isolated cantons, which the more honest Israeli leaders, and Ariel Sharon in particular, simply called Bantustans. That was more or less accurate, but not quite, because what Israel's doing in the West Bank is far worse than apartheid. The analogies to South Africa are quite misleading in that regard. The Bantustans were supported by South Africa. That's where their workforce lived. They relied on the labor from the Bantustans, so they had to sustain them and allow development. They were also hoping that the rest of the world would recognize them. In contrast, Israel wants the cantons to disappear. They don't rely on them for work. For their labor, they can now bring in the detritus of neoliberalism from around the world, Thailand, the Philippines, Romania, wherever there's some wreckage of the modern international economy. People go, just as Mexicans come here and so North Africans go to Europe, same kind of reasons, to try to get work in a rich first world country. So they do the labor, living pretty much in slave labor conditions, and the Palestinians are superfluous. They're okay to build settlements in the West Bank and so on, but Israel basically doesn't want them. So it's not the same as South Africa in that respect. The analogy's inaccurate. But Sharon was more or less correct in which he called them, when he called them Bantustans. Netanyahu, current prime minister, had a different characterization. He's actually, it's not too well known, but he's the first Israeli prime minister whose administration was willing to recognize a Palestinian state. The Labor Party, the so-called Doves, were adamantly opposed to it. Shimon Peres, he was prime minister up until 1996. When he left office, he stated very strongly that there will never be a Palestinian state. He was then defeated in the election. Netanyahu came in for the first electoral victory in 1996, and his Minister of Information was asked in a press conference whether Israel would ever accept a Palestinian state. And he said that Israel really didn't care much, whatever fragments of the country were being left to the Palestinians, because Israel didn't want them. If they wanted to call them a state, that would be okay. Or they could call them fried chicken. That's their choice. And that's the first recognition of a possibility of a Jewish state, and it's still the U.S.-Israeli position. Yeah, they can have a state or call it fried chicken in some scattered parts of the occupied territories. There are negotiations going on, as you know, or what are called negotiations. They're mostly farcical, but not for the reasons that are discussed. They're farcical because the negotiations are not between the correct choice of adversaries. I mean, a meaningful negotiation process would have some neutral moderator, you can pick it somewhere, and the two sides would be on the one side the world, and on the other side the United States and Israel, because for 35 years that has been the divide. The divide was made explicit in 1976 when the Arab states brought to the Security Council a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border. The U.S. vetoed it. Again in 1980. I won't run through the record, but essentially that's what it is until the present. There's actually one interesting and crucial exception. That's in January 2001. And it indicates what could happen if we can carry out our task of mobilizing and organizing American opinion to back, to compel the U.S. government to essentially join the world. This was in 2000. You may remember Clinton ran negotiations in Camp David. Had actually staked a lot in it. They collapsed. He blamed it on the Palestinians, on Arafat, but he soon recognized that that was inaccurate. Within a couple of months, he recognized that the position that the U.S. and Israel had insisted on at Camp David could not be accepted by any Palestinians, by Abbas, by the most conciliatory. And he changed his position. He issued what he called his parameters in December 2000, which were rather vague but more forthcoming. He then made a speech in which he said that both sides had accepted the parameters, but both sides had reservations, and they met in Egypt, in Taba, Egypt, to try to iron out their reservations. And we know a lot about what happened in those meetings. For one thing, there was an international monitor Moratinos from Spain. It gave a detailed record. It's reported in the Israeli press in some detail. And there's extensive scholarly work in Israel, both in Hebrew and even some in English, which go through the details of what happened. And they're all in agreement. What they say is that virtually all problems were solved, that the two sides came to pretty close to an agreement. There were some things still not settled, in particular the exact nature of the land swap that would be involved. In their last press conference, the two sides jointly said that if they had a little more time, they would solve that too, and there would be a settlement, pretty much in terms of the international consensus, which is a two-state settlement on the international border with minor mutual adjustments. But they didn't have a chance to do that. Israel, Ehud Barak, the prime minister, called off the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of that. There have been other initiatives, unofficial but high level, which came out with pretty detailed proposals, very detailed proposals along similar lines. The most important was the Geneva Accord, presented at Geneva a couple of years later. It was welcomed by most of the world, sent delegations and so on. Israel flatly rejected it. The U.S. just ignored it. So that sank. There's literature about it, but hasn't been pursued. Now that could be recovered. Not a lot has changed since 2001, but nothing really fundamental. If an American president were willing to tolerate a political settlement, to tolerate having the United States join the world on this issue, there could be a settlement. And it's worth remembering that if the United States decides on this, Israel has to go along. They really don't have any choices. So the crucial issue is whether the IDF, the army, will be withdrawn from the West Bank, and of course whether the siege of Gaza will end. If the U.S. insists on that, and there are things that we can direct our own actions towards that end, then it can happen. So these farcical negotiations that are going on are turning on expansion of the settlements. But that's a minor issue. The settlements themselves are criminal acts. Israel actually recognized that at the highest level back in late 1967, and it's been repeatedly, the conclusion has been repeatedly endorsed by the Security Council, most recently the World Court. So the settlements themselves are criminal acts. Whether they're expanded or not is beyond the current 42% of the territory with the kind of geographical framework that I described. It's not a very significant matter, minor matter. These debates are turning on that because it's so minor, and it diverts attention away from what's the real issue, which has to do with turning over the entire territory, maybe with minor and mutual adjustments, to Palestinian, legitimate Palestinian authorities. What would the legitimate Palestinian authorities be? Well, the obvious one would be some group elected in free elections. There actually was a free election. The only free election in the Arab world was in January 2006. The wrong people won. And as always happens, this is uniform case all over the world. As soon as the wrong people won, the U.S. moved at once to subvert and undermine the election. The U.S. supports democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. And that's been established even by conservative scholarship with practically almost no exceptions. And this is a case in point. As soon as the election took place, the U.S. and Israel instantly turned to punishing the population for voting the wrong way and extended the actions in operation since 1991 to separate Gaza from the West Bank and to continue the fragmentation of the West Bank so that if anything is left, it'll be maybe a state or called fried chicken or something like that. The next step, usual one, was to try to overthrow the government. If an election takes place, this happens everywhere. It's not just Palestine. So take, say, Haiti. Haiti had its first free election in 1990. Okay, the wrong person won. A populist priest who had the support of the large majority of the population, the slums and the hills. Wrong result. U.S. moved at once to undermine the government. 7 months later, there was a military coup which instituted a reign of terror. Right now, the U.S. is not, a couple of years ago, the U.S. and France, the traditional torturers of Haiti, intervened to kidnap the president, send him to Central Africa. They now are, the U.S. Obama administration is now supporting elections, but on condition that his party, which everyone assumes would win any election, is not permitted to participate. That's what we mean by democracy. And it's exactly the same in Palestine. Nothing new about it, just as there's nothing new about the Mavi Marmara. These are consistent, traditional, intelligible policies. So the next step in Palestine was to try to overthrow the government by a military coup. The U.S. did try to organize a military coup in 2007, and it failed. The Hamas organized in Gaza, repressed the coup attempt, and took over. That's described now, and this is another failure of ours that this picture remains. It's described as Hamas aggression to take over Gaza. In fact, unquestionably, it was a beating down of a military coup organized by the United States and Israel to try to overthrow the government. And then comes the usual, just more repression, more violence. Now, there's several steps in this partition that are very critical to understand for thinking about what we ought to do today. One was in August 2005, when, with very flamboyantly, Israel withdrew from Gaza. And that's presented as a very noble act, shows how deeply committed they are to peace and how nothing ever works, no matter how hard they try. The Palestinians always want more. What actually happened is that actually by the late 1980s, Israel understood that there's absolutely no point in holding on to Gaza. It had already been turned into a basket case under the occupation. There was virtually no point in keeping 7,000 or 8,000 settlers there, taking a large percentage of the land and of the water, the crucial water resources, and protected by half the army. In order to stay there, they were of no use to the state. So the smartest idea was to take them out and to resettle them in illegal settlements in the West Bank. Well, it could have been done very easily, just as the settlements in the West Bank now could be dealt with very easily. It could have been done simply by an announcement on August 1st, 2005, that the IDF, the army, is going to leave the Gaza Strip. At that point, the 8,000 settlers would climb into the lorries that are provided to them and moved from their subsidized homes in the Gaza Strip to their subsidized homes in the West Bank. Very quiet, no fuss, but no propaganda benefit. What was necessary was to stage what actually cynical and accurate Israeli commentators called to stage a national trauma, to make sure that on the front page of the Boston Globe, you may remember it, there's a pathetic picture of a little boy, clinging to his home while a soldier pulls him away. That pulls all the right heartstrings in the West. It keeps the money flowing. It works for the propaganda images and so on. Total, complete fraud. And to make the fraud even more obvious, it was a replay, a point-by-point replay of what Israel did when they were compelled to withdraw from the Sinai. In 1979, there was Camp David agreement. They had to withdraw from the occupied Sinai. Well, they had been building a big city there, a lot of settlements, so they evacuate them. So they played exactly the same game. In fact, there was a headline in the Israeli press, and at the time, in 1982, it was called National Trauma 1982. Let's put on this show for the world, about how we're suffering so in our dedication to peace, and then you say northern again, that slogan has to come through, and then you go on to the next crimes. That's happened in northern Sinai, happened in Gaza, and it tells you exactly what could be done in the West Bank. There's a lot of talk about how if Israel tried to forcefully evacuate the settlements, the army wouldn't obey orders, which is probably true. It would break up, the state would break up, therefore they can't do it. But they don't have to do it. What they can do is exactly what they could have done in Gaza, exactly what they could have done in northeast Sinai, withdraw the army. Probably 90% of the settlers will leave to their subsidized homes in Israel. And if some people, religious Jews from Brooklyn want to hang on to every rock, that's fine, they can. They can stay in whatever Palestinian state there is there. There's no reason to remove any of them. So that issue is just a total non-issue. It's propaganda construction. And the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip is what was designed to impose that imagery. Well, the next and maybe most critical step in breaking the Gaza Strip from Israel, from the West Bank, was in the invasion of the December 2008, January 2009 Israeli attack on Gaza. And again, I stress, U.S.-Israeli attack. U.S. was involved every step of the way. Arms, diplomatic support, ideological support, everything. One of the things that took place then, which didn't receive much attention, is that during the attack was horrendous. I don't have to describe it to you. I'm sure you all know about it. During that period, there were no demonstrations in the West Bank, no demonstrations of support. How could that be? Well, very simple. There's a U.S.-run army in the West Bank, run by General Keith Dayton. And its primary task was to make sure that there would be no manifestation of support for the victims of the U.S.-Israeli attack on Gaza. And in fact, that any people who did try to organize anything would be arrested. Now, this didn't get too much. In fact, it was so successful that Israel was able to transfer military units from the West Bank to the attack on Gaza. Well, this didn't get much publicity, but it was understood. For example, it was understood by our senator, John Kerry, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Obama's point man in the Middle East, who does most of the work. He's traveling around all over the region. He gave a very important speech in which the main point was that Israel forever has been desperately seeking peace, but there's never been a legitimate Palestinian partner. And now at last there's a legitimate Palestinian partner. They had one reason. There were no demonstrations in the West Bank. They had expected civil disorder, but it was very quiet, and he explains why. The U.S.-run army was able to crush any effort at demonstration. So now Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner, and we can move forward. We, of course, are the neutral arbiters to bring peace to the world. Okay, that's the imagery, and that's the understanding. And again, the fact that it is sustained is an indication of failures on our part. These things should be known, and the same is true, finally, of the attack itself. The invasion has been condemned. Like human rights groups, Goldstone Commission did condemn the attack. The condemnations were disregarded here and denied, but they're there, and they reach a lot of people. However, every one of those condemnations had a crucial, absolutely crucial legal and moral flaw, notably the Goldstone Inquiry. They all assumed that the attack was legitimate, but disproportionate. Take a look. Every one said legitimate self-defense, but disproportionate. That's a gift to Israel and the United States, because there was absolutely no legitimacy to the attack, to the action, for very obvious reasons. I mean, it takes real indoctrination to fail to see this. I mean, sure, Israel has a right of self-defense. Everyone does, but exercise, the use of force in self-defense is justified only under certain conditions. And a crucial one is that peaceful means have been exhausted. Well, in this case, peaceful means weren't tried. And they weren't tried because the U.S. and Israel knew that they would work. Take a little look at the background. In June 2008, there was a ceasefire agreement between Israel and the Hamas government. Israel announced at once that it was not going to live up to it. The terms of the ceasefire agreement were that the siege be lifted, and Israel said it wouldn't do it. Siege is an act of war, of course. So Israel immediately announced it's not living up to it, but Hamas did live up to it. And Israel officially concedes, you can read it on the government website, that during the period of the ceasefire there wasn't a single rocket. Now the ceasefire was broken on election day, November 4th, 2008, when Israel invaded, sent troops into the Gaza Strip, killed half a dozen militants. That led to an exchange of rockets, in which, as usual, every casualty was Palestinian. Hamas called for reinitiating the truce. Israel considered it, cabinet considered it, and they rejected it. They wanted to bomb. Well, under those conditions, if one bullet was fired, it was illegitimate. Disproportionality is you can't even talk about disproportionality because nothing was legitimate. Well, it doesn't even enter discussion. So powerful is the indoctrination and the propaganda that kind of grips the country, in this case, almost the entire West. Well, that's another task. It has to be broken. So what are the options, and what are the tasks for us? The options are, I think, usually misdescribed. If you look at the discussion of the topic, the options that are sort of suggested as alternatives, the only alternatives, are either a two-state settlement in terms of the international consensus, and then comes a phrase which you're not allowed to say, the international consensus that the U.S. has barred for 35 years. But let's break the rules and add that. So one option is a two-state settlement, roughly along the lines of the Taba Agreement. It's accepted by the entire world. Europe, Latin America, non-aligned countries, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, in fact, essentially everybody, except the U.S. and Israel. So that's one option. And it did come pretty close in the one moment when a U.S. government was willing to tolerate it, January 2001. The alternative that's discussed is that Israel take over the whole area, in which case there will be what's called a demographic problem in Israel. A demographic problem is a fancy way of saying too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, and that it'll be harder to pretend that it's a democratic Jewish state. I mean, that's a self-contradiction, but it'll be harder to sell it if you have 50% of the population is Palestinian, or maybe soon 70%. So that's a demographic problem, and something has to be done. And advocates of a two-state settlement commonly argue that, well, in Israel's interest, they have to do it, or they'll face this demographic problem. But the whole discussion is incorrect, because there's a third option. It's missing the third option, the one that's actually being implemented by the United States and Israel, which is the one that I described. That's the one that's being implemented, and the U.S. and Israel can continue to implement it. No demographic problem, because Palestinians are excluded from this. And they're left with, fried chicken, if you want to call it that. It's going to could get worse. There's now a proposal, has been for several years, a proposal advanced inside Israel. At first, it was proposed first by Avigdor Lieberman, the ultra-right-wing foreign minister. And when it was first proposed, it was condemned as virtually neo-Nazi. That is, the idea is that the areas within Israel of heavy Arab population concentration, which happen to be right along the international border, mainly in the Galilee and Wadi Ara, that they should simply be forcefully moved into some Palestinian territory, and Israel would take over the territories at once in the West Bank, that 40+%. Of course, over the violent objection of the inhabitants who don't want to go from a rich first world country to fried chicken, but they're irrelevant. So that was condemned as virtually neo-Nazi. By now it's the centrist position. It's been adopted by this chief spokespersons, including Tzipi Livni of Kadima, which is the centrist party. For what it's worth, it's been endorsed by the New York Times. The Ethan Brunner, the New York Times correspondent, he discussed this. He said this is a position that's a very good proposal. It should appeal to the left, he said, because it's favoring a two-state settlement. It could well be implemented, in which case what I described is even worse. Well, that's the third these are variants of the third option, and that's what's likely to come about unless we do something about it. So what do we do about it? Well, there are a lot of direct actions that can be taken. Among the crucial ones are those which were already discussed, like give direct assistance to the victims who are surviving and struggling and insisting and continuing to do it with dedication and resolution of the kind that you really have to feel humility when you see them doing it. Other parts of the world too. So that's one thing that can be done. Another thing that can be done is to support groups here that are, that's a matter of supporting institutions like the Gaza Mental Health Center, Palestinian institutions. And then there are organizations here that are contributing to their support, like the Gaza Mental Health Foundation here, or the Middle East Children's Alliance, and others. One of them, which happens to be of particular personal interest to me, is a new one that's in memory of my late wife, which is working on devoted to medical help for children who are victims of U.S.-Israeli violence in the territories, and there are others. So that's another layer of activity that's possible. Beyond that, there are direct actions, and there's many opportunities. I was just a couple of days ago reading a report from Finland, which is a military supplier to Israel. And by now there's, not on the scale of the United States, of course, but not trivial. There's now a significant movement within Finland with a lot of participants, including well-known people, calling for an end of any military aid to Israel. Well, there's also a proposal directed to the United States. It comes from a pretty prestigious source, Amnesty International. During the Gaza attack, there were many human rights statements that came out, but I think the most important one was from Amnesty International, which insisted that arms suppliers, they said to Israel and Hamas, but that means to Israel, should terminate supplies of arms to Israel that are used for illegal actions. Well, that's anything in the territories and anything that's used for aggression, including a likely sixth invasion of Lebanon, which may not be far away. So they urged cutoff. That's directed, of course, to the United States and directed to us to insist on a termination of supplies of arms used for criminal purposes. Actually, that's in accordance with U.S. law. The U.S. law requires that arms supplies to anyone be solely for defensive purposes, not for repression, not for aggression. That's illegal under U.S. law. So Amnesty International is calling on us to insist that the government keep to U.S. law. It doesn't sound like a very radical position, but pursuit of that goal, I think, is, of paramount importance and a very good organizing tool, I think, asking that the United States keep to its own laws. Okay, not terribly radical. Unfortunately, the Amnesty International proposal fell like a rock in the water, but again, that's our failure to keep it alive and put it forward. And then there are other actions. So, for example, this can be generalized, anything done in the United States that supports either the occupation or aggression, and aggression is likely to continue, ought to be the target of organized activity. So that's, boycott of Motorola, for example, or of Caterpillar, and a whole host of other possibilities. There's a whole range of such actions that are available, but none of them are going to get anywhere. None of them, unless there is popular understanding and support. And that leads to the least glamorous but most important action, namely just education and organization. Nothing is going to work without that. Not very exciting, but that's what has to be done. That's the groundwork for any achievement that's ever been made in human rights, either here or abroad. And it can't be neglected. There are many cases in point. I've mentioned a few of them, but you can go on. And it's a task that just has to be carried out, day after day, and it can make a difference. There are plenty of examples of how it made a difference. I won't go on with that. You all know about them. But I think that's the primary task that faces us. Thanks.
Couple of questions?
Just wanted to know if you could say a word or two about how to manage workplace and social blowback from the position that you're taking. Some advice to those of us who would have similar kind of blowback perhaps to deal with.
Some blowback? You mean the kind of counterreaction you're going to get?
Yes.
Well, look, that's for everything. I mean, any time you take any position that breaks out of the rigid ideological framework in which we exist, and is pretty rigid, is going to get a negative reaction. I mean, those of you who are old enough and who lived in Boston will remember perhaps that that was true in the early stages of the anti-war movement. Not so early, in fact. In the first public demonstration in Boston against the war in Vietnam, on the Boston Common, usual place for demonstrations. First one was in October 1965. Okay, it wasn't just blowback; it was broken up physically. The only reason I was one of the speakers, supposedly, the only reason the speakers weren't killed is because there were state troopers all over the place, and not because they liked what we were saying, but they didn't want to see bloodshed on the Boston Common. And it was broken up by students marching in from the colleges. You can take a look at the Boston Globe archives if they haven't erased it. The next day on the Boston Globe, there was a big attack on the demonstrators for daring to say very mild, embarrassingly mild things. Not to say, stop destroying South Vietnam, that was unmentionable. Stop bombing North Vietnam, a sideshow. There's a picture of a wounded war veteran on the front page, big diatribes. Well, that was October 1965, after 3 years of war. South Vietnam practically destroyed, a couple 100,000 American troops rampaging in the country. A couple of years later, there was a massive anti-war movement. That's the way things happen. Whatever. So yes, of course there'll be blowback. And in this case, it'll be pretty strong. Because although the population of the United States is not particularly supportive of Israeli actions, if you look at polls, powerful organized sectors are. And the most important ones are usually ignored. Just take a look. Which newspaper in the United States is most, outrageously supportive of Israeli actions? It's the Wall Street Journal. That's the journal of the business community. Which political party is the most supportive? The Republicans. The more dedicated of the business, two factions of the business party. And so it goes along the line. There are very powerful business lobbies supportive of Israel. The high-tech industry is deeply involved in the Israeli economy. The military industry, of course, for Lockheed Martin, it's a double bonanza. For one thing, the taxpayer buys their, F-35s to send to Israel. That's great. And then the oil producers demand that the United States sell them a second-rate equipment, which we want to get rid of, and it's on a huge scale. Obama just made a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia for essentially second-rate equipment that they have nothing to do with, can't do anything with. That's the biggest deal ever. So for the military producers, it's great. Give arms to Israel, that's a kind of a teaser, as they call it in the retail business. And then the oil producers buy even more, mostly useless equipment, which tightens their relations to the United States and also recycles petrodollars. So it's perfect. Intel, chip producers, building its biggest factory in the world for new generation chips in Israel. There's very close linkages, and there are military intelligence linkages and so on. There's also there's several lobbies. Numerically, by far the biggest lobby is the Christian Zionist lobby. That's huge. I mean, you have to remember that, in fact, Christian Zionism long precedes Jewish Zionism in the United States too, and it's a huge phenomenon. About a third of the population here believes that every word of the Bible is literally true, and that the second coming is going to be in their lifetimes. Well, for those of you who read the Bible, know what this means. It means that the warlord, the one we're supposed to worship, he promised the land of Israel to the Jews, and he also ordered them to slaughter everybody. Okay? He called for total genocide of the Amalekites, Midianites, and anybody who was in their way. Well, every word of the Bible is literally true, so okay, we should favor that. And there's a lot of support for it. A third of the population is not a small sector. And then there's the organized sectors of the Jewish population. By no means the whole population, but the organized parts of them are, just it's kind of like the Communist Party in Russia. Israel can do no wrong. And they have plenty of clout too. So there's going to be plenty of opposition, undoubtedly. Okay, that's true of whatever you undertake.
This probably has some connection with some of what you were saying with the financial issues. It's clear that the U.S. and Israel act in concert at all times. Your contention is that Israel won't do anything unless it has the permission of the U.S. Clearly, the U.S. has not used its leverage, like the things that you were talking about, to use our own laws about use of military equipment, the billions of dollars we give. And now we've just seen that President Obama couldn't even get Netanyahu to agree to an extension of a basically non-existent moratorium on construction. Well, so how do you explain that?
Well, first of all, I think we should state it a little more accurately. He didn't get Netanyahu to agree. That doesn't mean he couldn't get Netanyahu to agree. The question is, did he even try? And the answer is no. And we know it, in fact. Look, just take settlement expansion. As I said, it's not a huge issue. It's kind of a marginal issue. But there have been times when the United States opposed settlement expansion. In fact, there's one striking time, George Bush #1. It wasn't that he and James Baker were opposed to settlement expansion. They didn't like the arrogant and insulting way in which Israel was carrying it out. So the prime minister of Israel at the time, Yitzhak Shamir, was a very arrogant and abrasive. And what he would do is wait till James Baker, who's a kind of a patrician, he doesn't like to be pushed around by little people, they'd wait until he showed up in Jerusalem, and right at that moment, Shamir would announce a new settlement, insulting Baker to his face. Well, they didn't like that. Probably a little anti-Semitic undertone to that, but I'll skip that part. But they didn't like it. So Bush and Baker imposed limited, but not totally trivial sanctions. They withdrew loan guarantees. Okay, Israel instantly backed down. Shamir was thrown out. Peres came in. He's a more Western-oriented diplomat. He understands Western hypocrisy. So what he would do is, that's why he's considered a great dove and a great man. What he did is wait until Baker shows up and then tell Baker, yes, we agree, no more settlements, and then wait about 2 weeks, and then initiate the new settlement, and Baker and Bush were pretty happy. But the sanctions remained. They remained until Clinton came in. When Clinton came in, he didn't withdraw them in words, but he withdrew them in fact. The way he did it was to permit Israel to determine how much funding there was for the settlements. You can imagine what the result of that was. So that essentially ended the sanctions. Now, when Obama came in and made a couple of speeches about how there shouldn't be any settlement expansion, he was asked, his press secretary and those guys were asked, well, what will you do if they continue with it? And the answer was, well, our opposition is purely symbolic. And then they were asked specifically, are you going to do what George Bush #1 did? And they said, no, just symbolic. That's a wink. That's telling Netanyahu, do what you feel like. So I don't think there's any evidence that they tried. And if they do try, it'll be like it was with Bush.
So we have to make them try, right? We're going to make them try. Thank you, Noam. And thank everybody for coming. Sorry to kick you all out, but we have to.
That was Professor Noam Chomsky speaking on Thursday night, October 14th in Boston, Massachusetts, about the prospects of Palestinian justice. This event was a benefit for the Gaza Community Mental Health Program and recorded by Chuck Rosina for the Boston Community